So good morning or good day. Welcome to the Dangerous Data Podcast. I am here with Dr. Wes Smith. Say hi, Wes.
Hello.
So before we begin,
that's me saying hi.
Yeah, I know. Before we begin, I want to just give a quick disclaimer. What we're discussing here today is for entertainment purposes only, as we riff around the dangerous topics in data, subjectivity, censorship, free speech. Our opinions are not to be taken for medical advice. We do not reflect the opinions of our advertisers, sponsors, or employers. And with that, enjoy. Go ahead, Wes.
Yeah, so I think that today's topic was supposed to be about peer review, or will be about peer review. I think that's very relevant because we have a lot of outside influence, or I should say a lot of mental punting in the media, wherein someone would say, oh, we have a fact check, or we have a cited paper that supports one view, okay? And if you were to enter a discussion with someone and they say, well, where's your data, or something like that, you're often required to present peer-reviewed work, okay? And these fact checkers are often misinterpreting or presenting, while they present, peer-reviewed work. So, we often kind of punt our knowledge of the world onto experts who peer review and publish peer-reviewed research. So what is peer review? That's a great question. And I think it deserves discussion. So first of all, peer review, as we know it now, really only came around in the last maybe 50, 60 years. Okay, you could just do a Google search trends, or you could do a search history for peer review as a concept, as like something in the literature. Okay, the body of literature. It wasn't around in 1900. All right, so people who would shop around, Maxwell's equations or things like that, or when how do I say it? When Tony Van Leeuwenhoek was looking at his miniature cells and things like that. The peer review apparatus for scientific research classically didn't include what it includes today. Okay, partially that's because of this history of science, and I know this is a tangent, but this is important, I think, at least to me, and to understand how we got to the place we are. So one of the things is that most people who did science in the past were particularly of the aristocratic class, right? With the democratization of science, I guess you could call it democratization of science, or I should say the state, the state taking control of scientific apparatuses and funding, largely due to ethical concerns and the necessary amount of oversight if one were to do experimentation on animals, people, or dangerous molecules or things like that. There is somewhat of a necessity for, I guess you could say, state oversight over these things. With that became the advent of course, nearly ubiquitous grants that are still hard to get, and how we would grade these sort of things sort of became systemized. Okay, so your grants would be rated by peers and institutions, and your work additionally would be rated by peers and institutions. But the institutions, of course, became much larger, and universities became more widespread. And fast forward, decades and decades, what we have now is an apparatus of scientific publishing, where instead of talking to your aristocratic colleagues about what you found in some, with some neat chemical reaction, or, discovery you made with a microscope or a telescope, you shop your ideas around in academic journals, which of course have existed in the past, right? Royal Society, publishing, things like that, but now are much more systemized and widespread, and thus have far more, I guess you could say, paper pushing scrutiny on them. Okay, so I'm glossing over a lot, but suffice to say, being a scientist 100 or more years ago is a wildly different endeavor than it is now, largely because of how we communicate our results and how we receive our funding. Okay,
so can we talk a little bit about that as well, because a lot of people assume, now there's good and bad. Okay, and by this, okay, what I'm trying to narrow down is a lot of science is predetermined by the grants, right?
Yes.
My cousin is a federal grants officer for 20 plus years and a lawyer. And as a grants officer, he was telling me how grants are accepted and how you use the money and how you use the reporting, and how it has to basically, your outcome has to basically match what you say you're going to do. So you can get
Yeah.
right. And so could you explain that a little bit in the process? So what I want to get to is I
Yeah.
want to allude to the fact that science is a process. It's not a definitive guarantee. You still have to scrutinize the data. And what I'm trying to allude to is that there's usually inherent bias because it's still humans making the decision on data, humans having preconceived outcomes, and peer review that isn't always perfect. So that's my basic premise for this conversation.
You're hitting all the major points. So yeah, like I said, so when because of how we changed how we do science, it's not an aristocratic class who serves no one except for the Enlightenment values. It's a job, right? Scientist is a job now, and there are oversight factors, and now you have to submit your experiments to journals, and you have to get requests for funding to do the experiments, of course, from governments or private agencies. And so yes, what you do is you say, oh, I'm going to do this. I have a team that can do this. I have capability and record of doing this. I'd like to do this +1 or this plus, this mildly different way. And usually, okay, if you have a track record of doing research on a related project, that you might think that would suffice, but you actually also have to have preliminary data on this project. Oftentimes, the insider knowledge is that you've basically done nearly all of the experiments or piloted nearly all of the experiments that you say that you're going to do. Maybe you have less N, or you maybe didn't use 1 or 2 of the drugs that you said you would do. You maybe need funding to procure that, or expertise for doing some sort of hiring someone out to do these experiments that you mostly did. So you've gotten almost all these these things marked off that you said you're going to do, but you've mostly done them. And then you finish the experiment, then you publish it, right? That's actually how it works. A grant proposal isn't something that's like you have none of the things in place for. You actually have nearly all of the things in place for. You have nearly all of, you have, I don't want to say it's 100% done. I can't say that. It's more like, so signing percentages is difficult, but the idea is nearly fully fleshed out. If you find something new about the project, that would be great, and that becomes a different paper. Or a couple other papers or someone else's thesis or something like that. But you have nearly everything ready to go, and you just need a couple extra data points in most cases for these things. So right off the bat, the principle in which you're publishing something that is not yet done is not quite true. You've already done the work. So you have an idea to actually accomplish this goal, okay? And it would be silly to not do science. It would be silly to do science without having any goals, right? It's impossible. You need to have some sort of aim, right? The issue is that you have a preconceived idea of what you want to do, and then you make your figures, and you have all of these experiments planned out in such a succinct order that, okay, this is going to show us this. This will give us reason to do this, and we're going to do this, okay?
Or you look on the database of grants that are available, and then you build your grant application to what the grants that are available.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's a very good point. So I don't want to call that gaming the system, but if you have the capabilities to do that thing, and you see that there's money for it, you do the thing, because you need the money. You got to hire people, and you got to keep your lab running. So
I would suggest, you know what we should do is also interview my cousin. That would be great. He's a grants officer.
You should.
Talking about how we should do that. His name's Owen Northern. So that's good. So,
I should say I want to say I have experience in this. So I've had a couple of grants funded. I've had one. You can look at my papers and my most recent one on bioRxiv, which it's not peer reviewed, by the way, but it's going to be, where I list my funding sources. So I've had one T32 grant funded by Institute on Drug Abuse, and then one grant that I'm on currently, which I co-wrote, that's funded by the Korean National Research Foundation, which is nearly equivalent in terms of payout to an R01, which is quite a lot of money. I'll say that. So although I'm not like a senior PI or someone who's gotten like, I haven't gotten a kangaroo grant, and I haven't gotten like a an official RO1 or even an R21. So I guess you could say I'm a relatively new investigator.
Could you define those terms for our audience?
Oh, they're just types of grants. You can just look them up yourself. They delineate how much funding is available for your project. Okay, it's like the holy grail is like RO1s and ROOs, things like that. And if you're a postdoc trying to transition to a professor, you want like a K99 grant.
Yeah, give us an example of the range of the grants.
Like $250,000 a year, I think, is like one of the lower limits for like an RO1. But again, I could be wrong. I've been in Korea for a while now, and I was actually in biopharmaceutical research before that for nearly like a year and a half or so, something like that. So I didn't have to worry about funding then. So before that, like the T32 grant that I was on funded my grad school for like 2 years. So like it was maybe like, I think it was like 30,000 or something a year. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember all these amounts. So like it ranges from like funds one grad student for a little bit to funds several postdocs for years, right? And the more grants you have, the more you're going to get in the future, because it's a sign of how productive your lab is. It's like that biblical principle, the Matthew principle. What is it? To those who have everything, everything will be given. More will be given. To those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. That's basically Zipf's law.
That's a law. Isn't that the law? Isn't that physics, to be honest with you, right?
It's purely physics. It's math and physics purely, and people don't seem to understand how important Pareto distributions and Zipf's law
I was just going to say the Pareto
study these things.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, right?
It's in the brain too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So
thank you for that. Go ahead.
We're getting sidetracked. I wanted to talk about, with peer review, basically, you shop your ideas around after you have your paper, ready. You have your figures collected based off of the data you've both preliminarily collected, and maybe your grad student or you found something kind of unique and you added a couple more figures onto it to describe your observations. We can of course talk about scientific observations and how they aren't necessarily facts, but a narrative. To explain hypotheses, but I have previously already explained how truth is not necessarily fact, but a method towards guiding inquiry, and so the scientific paper is a very streamlined version of that, right? But it's not necessarily truth per se.
Yeah. So
it's limited to your artifice.
Yeah. Let's revisit that statement. Let's revisit that statement for people that haven't listened to the other episodes. Is that truth is a series of questions until you stop, and then when you stop learning.
Pretty much. And so how do I put this best too? If I have an idea about how the world works as a scientist, that idea is mine alone, and I can share that with people, right? Is it a cogent explanation for the world, given what we also already know about how the world works? And when you say, okay, what is knowledge, right? Let's pare that back. Well, it's as simple as, does the sun rise every day, right? What do you mean by that? Okay, does the sun actually rise, or are we spinning around the sun, right? It's a figure of speech to describe the natural phenomenon, but it turns out everything becomes to be like that as you get more and more core to these things. You're describing natural phenomena in a way that's limited both by our own
understanding,
speech,
right,
and our understanding,
linguistic
and our artifice,
right? Linguistic relativity, right.
Exactly. So put another way, okay? What we know fundamentally is limited to what we can posit about math,
and ability to describe
and ability to describe it. Like fundamentally, the concept of mathematics is a way to describe the real world, right? But also a logical framework to describe the real world, right? So like 1 + 1 is 2. We know that because we define one as one thing. Yes. I'm not going to get into proofs on these.
Right. Yeah. It's how math. Yeah, I know. It's linguistic relativity. It's how language and mathematics work together to frame the universe as we understand and know it. And how.
But you have to. That's the
right. And how different.
That's the fundamental.
Right. And how different languages are instrumental to describing different things.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, various concepts about this and various, I probably mentioned to you about like what blue and green are in different languages and how it's actually relative. There's no like universal standard for what you would call blue, right? Or what you'd call green. And at any rate, okay, if I were to record a neuron using, my recording techniques that I talk about in my papers, I'm not actually looking at neurons, right? I'm not actually looking at action potentials. You can't see an action potential, right? You use an electrode to interpret a proxy for ion flow in a membrane of a unit that may or may not be there. It could be an artifact. It could be a neuron that you don't know is there. It could be a variety of things, right? But if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably
it behaves in these,
fired by a neuron.
It's like calculus. If it behaves in this manner, then
in vision we call these methods of gathering multiple data streams. In vision I think it's called parallax. Basically, you want to grab as many different types of data points and use as many sensors as possible to ascertain whether or not something is real, right? Otherwise, you could just be living in an illusion. Like that's how we get truth, or at least approximate truth. I've been banging on about this for years now, but like everything we have is just an approximation of what ground truth is. Like we know we're real, right? I know I'm real. I have a pretty good idea I'm real. Otherwise, nihilism. So if I'm real and I can use pretty good ways of verifying the world is real, verified by other people who then I can discuss with and use their machines and things like that, read their papers, we can kind of have a better and better approximation for how the world works. And that's how ideally science works, right? So the point of the paper is to, kind of shortcut all that and say, okay, you can read this other stuff, and then, here's what I found about this, and here's the way I think it works. I have a hypothesis or an idea how I think this works. I tested that, and this is a cogent explanation in my point of view of how this thing works. Okay, but that's where it rubs up against what people think they understand about science and how it actually works. These are all just cogent ideas typically to explain how the world works.
So it's kind of like
and that's how it's always been.
Right. So it's reason and rhetoric. You're using rhetoric and a series of questions to get to the new info. Like this is a given. Based on the fact that this is a given, let's extrapolate further, and here's what we have. And
your givens could be entirely wrong. Look, we talked about this last week about the Alzheimer's, what was it, aggregates, right?
Yeah.
I forget which aggregates were found to be, fraudulently pursued.
Man, that's scary. That's scary.
But and so when you realize, okay, so people can have fraudulent results, or their technique is just not good. Their papers, even cornerstone papers, are just not worth.
Yeah, and then that entire field gets changed. And so we build upon,
and that doesn't always get acknowledged. It doesn't always get acknowledged, and so
amen. And this is where I want to get to. This is what I want to get to, because I think what we're doing is you're creating the foundation of what I want to hammer home, is that entire realms of science are often built upon data that might be off, data that might be incorrectly interpreted, and then science is never settled. So the whole concept that we've been programmed by the elite and those in power of trust us, trust the science means question. So by nature, science.
I want people to question me. I want questioning, because then that's how I learn more.
Yes. So the process is a science of sharpening, right? And so far, this is what we've learned so far. And here's the data that we have. And this is the experiments that we've done to prove it. Okay. So brilliant. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to read you something. I'll share my screen.
Haven't even gotten to peer review yet. I'm just talking about papers are just conjecture.
This will go with it, right? Can you see?
Yeah.
Which screen can you see?
I see Nobel and Novice, the author prominence effects peer review.
Okay, great. So this is a really good document, and it talks about bias in peer review. So peer review is a well-established cornerstone of the scientific process.
I have a bug in front of me. Sorry, there's a mosquito. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yet it is not immune to status bias. Metrion identified the problem as one in which prominent researchers remember we talking about the Pareto distribution, right?
Oh yeah, there's
All right.
competence hierarchies in research.
Right. Get disproportionately great credit for their contribution, while relatively unknown researchers get disproportionate little credit. So those that produce more. We measure the extent of this effect in the peer review process through a pre-registered field experiment. We invite more than 3,300 researchers to review a paper jointly written by a prominent author, a Nobel laureate, and by a relatively unknown author, an early career research associate, varying whether reviewers see the prominent author's name and an anonymized version of the paper or the less known author's name. Well, that's just a given, isn't it? But would you like to extrapolate on that?
Well, so there's again this freaking mosquito here. Yeah. So if you have a famous guy next to you who's, putting their name on your work together, that's a huge bonus, right? And that's why people always want to go to rich and famous labs, because part of it is that, yeah, they're competent and they can probably teach you something about doing science in a very critical way. The other part is the star power, that having a very well-connected and very highly respected PI can help your career as well. That's why you go to various institutes at UCLA, for example, or where I'm from, or other highly ranked universities. The most famous PIs have really big labs and a lot of students, because people want to be around them. And of course that expands out to like international scholars and Nobel laureates. Of course you'd want to be on co-author with them, because it can only help you. It adds credence to whatever work you're doing. It adds an air of authority about it. It's not like these things are totally like coldly calculated. Like how does the paper look? Is their data solid? Is this a cogent interpretation?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes back to the other stuff that you've read. Well, it goes to everything, correct? It's like the other stuff that they've read and that you found sound, and that or is in topic of discussion. So what's interesting is I wanted to get to the social aspect of things, right? So yeah. Our world is built basically on our perception, right? So our perceptions are, absolutely. And we are social beings by nature, right? We are inherently social. So our need to connect and communicate with each other is basically inherent to our being as humans. And so we identify ourselves both individually and in groups. And a lot of times, this is like the Peter principle. The greatest thing about it is also our greatest weakness. So one of the greatest things about us is the ability to identify groups and values based upon preconceived calculus. But at the other, it also limits us to new information or access to information we would not otherwise have. And so could you, I guess, talk about that in terms of, we're going to put this on Anchor. It won't necessarily be on Facebook, so we can talk about things a little more risky.
Well, I think you were going with something there. I don't want to interrupt you. You had something you wanted to say.
What I wanted to say was a good example of this would be the letter that EcoHealth Alliance and Fauci wrote to the Lancet to debunk their theories when it was found that they themselves were nervous about their own research being part of the problem. And so it was basically admitted by the Lancet, which is one of the greatest retractions in scientific history, was the retraction of the Lancet. So first they wrote a letter saying the lab leak theory is bogus, here's why. And because it was these big names, nobody really went in and questioned it or checked science. And so those in power limited questioning of their own behavior and activities that should be questioned. And I'm not drawing any preconceived notions. What I'm just trying to state is that they knew that their own work was questionable, and they went to silence it. In the scientific community, the Lancet of all things, went along with it until about a year and a half later, when it was retracted and a big apology was made. So,
which letter was retracted? I think it's important that people.
The Fauci Health Alliance. I have it all down, but yeah. So I'm getting to the fact that
You can append that. You can append that in the if there's like a video comment section or a video.
Yeah, I'm getting to the part that science is a series of questions based on data. Is the data sound? How was it collected? Is the interpretation of the data sound? Then, are the questions asked of the data sound? Then, do we pull our answers soundly from the data as we interpret it? And then let's get to the whole language and social structure. We are inherently social beings. We identify ourselves into, groups based upon race, religion, creed, values, all sorts of stuff. And so we also
funding sources,
right? And so we have inherent bias. And so science is supposed to be outside of that. Math is supposed to be. And so, but
I mean, the idea of like, okay, if I'm recording these neurons or I'm culturing these cells, there should be no politics associated with that, and there should be no outside influence. It should be me and my recording electrode and my cell incubator and my fume hood and things like that, right? And my molecules and my all these things, right? But at the end of the day, you got to interpret that. And you have your own understanding of the literature and your papers that you've read. Everyone else has different papers that they've read. There's like, I've never met someone who's read the exact same papers as I have. You can take two scientists. Have you read this body of literature? Well, they might have like some overlap, but everyone has slightly different, other amounts of literature that they've read, right? So like everyone has slightly different understandings of where the field is, where it's going, where it's been, what's going on right now, what's hot, what's not. So everyone has their own flavor of understanding science, right? Because of that, how you do everything in the paper publishing process from your idea, like, okay, what's hot right now? How can I incorporate that into my work? People will think it's interesting and new, and then they'll get more likely to be, in a well-published journal. Like that's like a meta aspect of it that we didn't even touch on. And then we have the other issues of, are you good at your technique? Did you cite the appropriate papers? Are the figures constructed well enough to be interpreted by people? Like that's a data design, it's a design problem, and a lot of scientists just suck at that. And then, do your results make sense? Are you constructing your results in a way that tell a story? That's important because everything we do, like I said in the science, is a narrative in the story. Are you constructing it, and is there a flow to it, and can it be logically interpreted? And then are your conclusions pushing a certain narrative or pushing your preferred hypothesis at the expense of others? And are you willing to acknowledge your shortcomings? And are you using weasel words when you describe something?
What's a weasel word? Did you say weasel words? Weasel words?
Yeah. We use weasel words. I like using, I learned that from Wikipedia many years ago, but I think it's important because the proximal origins paper of SARS-CoV-2 is full of weasel words. Just read it. There's not even any statistics in it.
Right.
Another thing is we rely on statistics to have confidence in our data, right? That they're not due to chance, right? That's another thing is that again, it's not facts. It's do we have a worldview that is cogent, that if we were to do these things again, and we hope that they describe how things actually work with a certain amount of confidence. And there's, biology is wet. Things don't always work the way you want, but there's likelihood that it mostly works the same way in a certain context. That's where statistics come in. But of course, you can lie with statistics too, or you can be an idiot and not know how your data are distributed and what's the proper test to do based off your experimental groups. Like you could just get everything wrong and then communicate it poorly with math, and people will think that, well, you're a scientist, you should know what you're doing. We trust you, and it's not really worth trust if someone can't do the stats properly.
So speaking of that trust in scientists, let me read this. Statement in support of
yes, the Lancet,
yeah, public health officials, medical combating the virus, right? So the rapid, open, transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened, right? So the rapid sharing of data is being threatened by an idea that is verboten. So think about the language here. So the rapid, open, transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation. So misinformation.
That's just a Russell conjugate. That's just a label.
Right, around its origins. Wait a second. It's February of 2020. how do we know what its origins are? Huh, Dr.
They
Evil.
didn't do any statistical testing.
Right.
Yeah.
How can you do it? Right. So we stand together and strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that it does not
Well,
have natural origin.
I see 6 people's names on that. So, I mean, 6 people standing together is not many when you consider the other, you know, millions of scientists in the world who have other different opinions. Yeah.
Right. And so
way to construct that, Lancet and Peter
right.
Daszak.
And this was written by Fauci and his team to cover up their gain of function research at the lab.
So Fauci was on this? Because
yes,
you would think that if you were an
it's
author.
revealed through his emails that, so it was revealed through his email. So I'll get through it. So the Lancet lied.
And this, by the way, this isn't a paper. This didn't even go through peer review. And it's the same thing as the proximal origins paper. It's not really a paper.
Right.
It's a letter to the editor.
Right.
You don't peer review those.
And it's meant to silence dissent. This letter was used in the Lancet by Facebook, Google, the US government to silence any questioning of the origins for 2 years. So the world leading medical journal published an article explicitly condemning their work. So, yeah. So anyway, they funded it, they covered it up, and now it's, you know, it's just a mess. I've got a lot of links on here to describe, but we don't have enough time to.
Well, I know that he was on these emails. I read some of them. He coordinated basically a campaign very late at night, and within a couple of days they had a draft they put up on virological.org of the proximal origins paper. Okay, and so he and various other, you could just look up Fauci's emails. He had like Christian Anderson was on it, and Holmes and all these guys. Yeah, of course you can see that. Yeah, I mean, this should be common knowledge at this point that they privately thought it was a lab leak, and they even put, SARS gain of function paper 2015 in, Fauci sent that in an email, and then later denied knowing that these sort of things were considered gain of function. Like, he called it gain of function privately.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of weirdness. I don't want to, I should say that, of course, I think that there's a lab origin extraordinarily likely, just going by preponderance of what would be called circumstantial evidence. I mean, if they wanted to come clean about this stuff, they're welcome to, but just judging by their behavior privately would suggest that there's some sort of laboratory origin, and they have a vested interest in hiding that.
So for those that can't,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, for those that can't see, so far I've put on the Lancet, the New York Post, the Denver Gazette, New York Post again, State of the Nation, amongst others. So the point being that I wanted.
I mean, these things were found through FOIA requests too.
Yes.
So it's not like this is it's not like it's a left-right issue. These were found by FOIA requests.
Right.
So these agencies, and some of them international, I believe there's a Dutch scientist and a few British scientists on this as well. They were, brought into the mix, and since these emails are on government servers paid for by taxpayers' money, people could request them. And so, because of that, now we know what they were actually conspiring about. This is what's actually a conspiracy: is when you have people discussing things in private. That's the actual conspiracy.
Yes,
to influence the narrative.
I want to say this, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, because I'm trying to get somewhere. Is that I wanted to talk about how science is fallible, but it's a series of questions. I wanted to talk about how it's led by people, including peer review. Those who are trusted because of their reputation get more publishing, get more authority, and how those who we trusted most were covering their behind and actually misleading us.
Well, we trust Fauci. We trusted Fauci because he'd been in his position for the longest. But just because you've been there for the longest doesn't necessarily mean you deserve it.
But we weren't allowed to question. It got to a point to where we weren't allowed to question. Now you can talk about your banning from LinkedIn.
Oh boy, I still wanted to talk about. There's other things I wanted to talk about before we get into my sob story. So regarding peer review, I think the final issues about that is that done by people that aren't paid for that job. So first of all, you're not even going to get the best work possible. You're getting people that are grudgingly doing it because they want to stay on good terms with journals, and they want to, they have an idea that, okay, if I don't do it, then maybe this work is bad. It'll go through. There needs to be some sort of gatekeeping function, right? There's a utility in that. And peer review, no one likes to get handed a paper that they didn't want to read unless it's really truly interesting to them, right?
Right.
But right off the bat, you have the issue of haranguing reviewers and grabbing professors and people at institutions to do the work for you. But these papers then are then put up on a server that you have to pay for as an author to show people. That used to be the case that they were all behind money, like a paywall. And now for early access, it's behind.
Wasn't that what got the guy from MIT to kill himself?
Yeah. What was his name? Aaron something?
Aaron Mate, or was it not Aaron Mate? But yeah, remember? Yeah, exactly.
So he had like a little bit of a sneaker net going where he would just like upload papers and stuff, and they finally caught him. And then after that, of course, a little too late, but yeah, he killed himself. And now, in most cases, all scientific findings are available. In most cases, not all, they're available after a certain amount of time has passed. Still, if you want to read them first, you have to pay for institutional access to these things. So you might be scratching your head saying, well, if I'm a citizen of this government and they're the ones that did this research,
right,
and then why do I have to pay for access to the
stuff that I've already paid for?
Yeah. And so this is that's a huge issue. That's like a huge
Where does that money go? And then who gets that money? The institutions, right?
Elsevier. The publishing houses, basically.
Right. What a great business, bro.
Yeah. Hey, Nature, if you want to hire me, Elsevier, please. I want to. I'll be your editor. I'll do that. I'll take some money. Yeah. No, it's really silly. The amount and type of money that has gone into like scientific publishing is just mind-boggling. It just gets it's more expensive as the time goes by. And even for like really shit tier journals, pardon my English there, but really poor tier journals will have been sending me like requests to publish my new work, and they still want me to pay them. Like you can't even no. I'm not going to pay you. You should be paying me to publish in your crap bogus journal. Okay. Where was I going to go with this? Gatekeeping in peer review is important. It has a role. You want to keep the cranks out, and you want to keep the bad ideas out, right? And you want to, let the best, most rigorous ideas in, right? But oftentimes, right, your reviewers are your competitors, okay? Because they're the ones who would know about your project. They would know about the ins and outs of the field. And so if the people who know the ins and outs of your field aren't in your lab or aren't your friends, who are they? They're your enemies. They're your competitors. They're the ones that are taking your grants from you, basically. They're the ones who are buddies with the NIH or whatever, right?
Right.
I mean, now that's conspiratorial thinking. It's paranoid, but like, if someone
the logic is sound. The logic is sound.
Look, if you don't know them personally, and they're publishing on the same thing as you, and they're competing for grants, they're competitors, and so they have early access to your work. If you have the option to say, I don't want this person to publish, or not to publish, I don't want this person to review my paper when you submit it to a journal. But in general, if you want to have a good, solid peer review that will have good remarks and things like that, it's going to be going to the most senior people in the field, or postdocs in their lab, and they're gonna critique it quite heavily, or deny it even access to the journal in publication. And in that sense, gatekeeping is good and bad, because now you of course you verify the merit of a paper, but you can also shut it down due to politics. And if someone doesn't like your hypothesis or the way that you've gone about testing it, or they don't like you, they can put the kibosh on that rather immediately. And Eric Weinstein talks about that a lot.
Yes.
What he would call the distributed idea suppression concept and the gated institutional narrative.
I know.
I don't want to sound like exactly. that's truly, that's part of what scientific publishing is. It's a peer review is a gatekeeping process that has pros and cons. One example is this is I'm an outsider in the field of neural criticality, and I published I've posted online on bioRxiv. We can probably put a link to that later. My paper on neural criticality in a model of early cocaine abstinence in vivo in mice, and
yeah, like
I had
a harm reduction research.
I wouldn't say it's harm reduction necessarily. It's more like understanding the computations, like fundamentally in a mesoscale circuit in the brain. And how can we scale up our ability to understand circuitry and neural patterns with a novel way of assessing and quantifying brain criticality and complexity. Okay.
So how can we understand it more?
Yeah, we have to quantify it, and now we're talking about my project, which is great. I love doing that, but suffice to say, I'm one of the only people who have quantified neural criticality in this particularly novel way. No one else has done that. Then you can, of course, with it quantified, you can test it in other ways because it's measurable now. So what I was saying is that as an outsider doing research that is sort of I don't want to call it a boys club, but like a rich club, or like something like there are insiders in that field. Right. And so as an outsider, now I have to submit my work for their review, right? And they might be like, well, who's this guy? He didn't work with us. It's totally, I hope they don't think like that. But like, the idea is that if you are an outsider,
there's always human bias. There's always, and let's get back to
bias.
There's always human bias that comes into play, right?
And not only that, but novel research that is not like incremental hypothesis, like very small hypothesis testing research, like exploratory research, which is largely what my work had been. That is oftentimes that's the riskiest in terms of like, are you going to get a result or not? That is oftentimes frowned upon because it's like, where does this fit into the narrative that we're building around this hypothesis? Like you come in here out of left field with this multidisciplinary work that's juggling various things, and then can we believe it? And that's the thing. It's like actually,
and then who are you to do such a big, bold, novel claim, right?
Right. Exactly. And I'm not saying I'm bold or anything. I'm just looking at things in a thank you. But there's like, different ways of looking at things and combining different things to create an alchemy of science, right? And we as funding in the agencies, really, they have disincentivized exploratory work in favor of very, very safe research.
And when I say safe,
I'm not talking about gain of function research, which is heavily invested in by governments. It's existentially risky. Okay, I'm talking about like, are you going to get a result or not? And this goes way back to the beginning of the conversation, where it's like, did you design these figures beforehand and collect all this data beforehand before you submitted the work? And the work that I was doing was like, it's out there, man. It's like I wrote my own algorithm to quantify criticality in the brain. I wrote my own avalanche collecting scripts and all the stuff, and did a lot of paper reading to come up with this project. And it was very new at the time. It still is very new. But because it's outsider research in a way, it's subject to that certain type of scrutiny. And because it's risky research in the sense that there's no guaranteed like payoff from it. There's no like, it's basic research. It's neurophysics, right? I can't necessarily market a drug directly from this. And I can't say that I understand a certain biomedical pathway directly from this, right? And oftentimes, a lot of people will just pay lip service to that when they write a paper. They say, "Oh, this is relevant to this disease, and this state." So they pay lip service to that. But do they really think that? Not necessarily. And so, yeah, this scientifically risky, not existentially risky, but like risky work, which is just mostly exploratory, is heavily disincentivized. You actually have to have like a certain very concrete pathway that you're incrementally adding on. But that's really lame when you think about it. Like science shouldn't just be like very incremental approaches to something. You think not only in this small hypothesis-driven way, but also these lateral approaches that just cut across and think in multiple disciplinaries, in a multidisciplinary way to achieve I think, a bigger picture knowledge of something. So that was my spiel on, like, okay, we talked about like how a paper is constructed, how science has shifted from being, to being more run by publishing houses and government funding institutions, how scientists have gamed the way that they publish papers to get better access to these journals, and how a rich club or a group of scientists within subfields have control over essentially what can get published based off of politics. And finally, how in general things are disincentivized from publishing, especially if they're not necessarily very concrete in hypothesis testing, or I should say very incremental in hypothesis testing, like exploratory research. And you can look this up, like how you just Google this, exploratory research disincentivized, And I had a paper pulled up as well. I recommend people look up this paper called The Limitation Store Understanding of Peer Review. I'm not saying we get rid of peer review entirely, that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there does need to be something different about it, which is something I'll probably talk about. Now, do we want to talk about my banning from LinkedIn?
So we've got about 10 minutes as time. How about this? Let's talk about, okay, so
go ahead.
The premise, folks, for what we're trying to accomplish here is, one, to understand what is truth. Truth is a set of questions that are always being interpreted, and it's a process, right? It's a process of questions over time that build upon established truths. Sometimes, like the Alzheimer's data, we find out that the data that we understood is wrong, and it throws the entire field into disarray as all the.
Well, it should, but the thing is, not every people still publish cite papers that have been retracted. People still cite papers or refer to a body of literature in certain fields that are bunk, and they keep doing it.
It's like fake news stories, right? So people still cite fake news because it fits their narrative or it fits their pre-established mental framework of the universe. So
there's no problem with having a way that you want to look at the universe. Like, that's natural. You want to look at you have your own way of understanding the universe. Of course you want to tell people about that. Of course you want to explain the universe in what appears to be a cogent fashion. But is it really parsimonious, right? How can you get to see what parsimonious is? You have to have open, honest discussions with people about that.
And so, that being said, the interpretation at the end of it is all human. How the human interprets the data, how the human communicates that data, who the human is, his social standing, and the Pareto principle comes into publishing and all of that. To that end, once the data is there, the control of the narrative can be done by, as we exampled, the EcoHealth Alliance letter to the Lancet, where they use big sweeping words and, as you call it, weasel words to silence dissent in open, honest scientific debate. The purpose of
these are not even elected. These aren't even elected officials. These are just like, oftentimes it's like, okay, there's these papers that that they were published and they were funded publicly, and they ostensibly went through peer review, but we're going to ignore them. This is
right.
These are conspiracy
because
theories.
We're going to choose this data and this stuff that supports what we want in predetermined outcomes.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to get with everything that we're doing on this podcast is the politicization of science and the inherent bias in people to predetermined outcomes, and to explore all sides of an issue as much as we can to say, hey, these are the problems that we so far have seen, and these are the ramifications. So far, this world policy has been set on either bad data, non-existent data, all for nefarious ends, either to seize more power or by those too ignorant to understand what was really going on. So
I think there's a Pareto distribution in terms of malevolence as well. Like, you have 10% or 1% of the people. No, really, if you have people in power or have positions of authority,
I'm only laughing because that's a great way to think about Charles Schwab.
I talk about this with my wife as well, like a lot. And she's like, well, yeah, sure. You have these people like Fauci and, all these people at the top, like, they probably know what they're doing, right? Then you have like 90, 80, 99, 90% of other people who are just following orders, and they're too ignorant to question things.
Or they
So,
want
you
to
know,
keep their pension, or they want to stay employed.
oh yeah,
They're in pension,
oh
right?
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So with that said, I want to leave on, we've got about 5 minutes, but let's take 10. Let's talk about, and I'll leave it to this real quick. Let's talk about how social media is silencing open debate, and it's nefarious because it's making the world dumber. And then use how, honestly, let's be honest. So you're banned by an idiot in Silicon Valley because what you have to say is not popular, even though it's backed by.
Oh, it's popular. Let me tell you something. I had tens of thousands of views on my stuff, far more purchased than what I have on Twitter. Largely because I'm protected on Twitter. You know, I stupidly thought that it'd be a good idea to post this stuff on LinkedIn, where people are a bit more professional and a bit more rational. But it turns out LinkedIn is just woke office politics.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. So you want to talk about how big tech is silencing. So we didn't get into this either, but big tech worked with the Democrat Party and the Biden administration to silence
White House and CDC. Yeah.
Yeah, and not only that, but political opposition and unpopular political views that are protected by the First Amendment. So policy, politics, and the keys of power are held by those who are claiming to own the science and claiming to be the science and claiming to be the truth, when in effect, they're not. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, the long and short of it is that I was banned briefly in June for like 4 or 5 weeks, and then again, most recently, permanently at the end of August. And the reason for that is because I'd literally post scientific papers and then come up with some interpretations based off of them. I wouldn't say X is the truth, or blank it's this way. I would say, okay, let's consider this, and I would ask questions about it, and then 1 or 2 times maybe I would say, Fauci is a swamp person or something like that, like, just to add a little bit of levity, to add a little bit of humor, I should say, to these things, because it's all so deep and serious all the time. But I would never say, what I say is 100% fact or things like that. I would post papers and say, it seems to be the case that, we have this, so maybe we should reconsider our policies on this as well. Or, it bears consideration, right? And, I would talk about like uptake of mRNA from the COVID transfections or therapeutics, however you want to call them. Which is definitely actually happening in some people. Biological treatments are, like I said, leaky, and not everyone has the same body per se at the genetic or molecular level, like in terms of functionality, exactly the same, right? And so, some people are affected by these things differently, and some people will definitely have, integration of these things into their genome, just especially if you look at the numbers of it. And I guess it's illegal on LinkedIn to say these things that are basically, it's a very cogent scientific thought, right? It's a cogent way of expressing numbers in terms of transfections. And if you post a paper about hepatocytes that now express mRNA long term, because the cell's been transfected with a genetic product, I mean, that's a no-no. You can't do that. But that's definitely what happens sometimes. And other times I said something like, oh, the CDC, the most recent one, the ban most recently, they cited 3 of the things that I said. One of them was the CDC changed their guidance. Why can't I discuss that? And YouTube says one thing about what I can discuss, but LinkedIn says something else. So are there 2 standards of how we approach the truth, or 2 standards of truth? I said. Yeah, they didn't like that as well either. Like, just asking questions, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at how Jordan Peterson was kicked off of Twitter when he was using very, very sound logic. How can you use the word? How can you dead name someone? Right, I'm trying to be very careful. How you dead name somebody? When does that make everything they did before invisible and non-existent? Or do you now refer to the past as the present, or the present as the past? And that was and because that was too
I'll
rational.
be honest with you. I don't believe in the concept of dead naming as
Yeah,
something
neither do I. But I'm saying he used really logical discussion on a social issue, and they banned him for it because there are questions that are verboten, and it's getting to the point to where real honest discussion based on reason and rhetoric are now too dangerous because it goes against the end narrative of a preconceived notion and a dialectic that's been set. So we're no longer living in a real honest world. We're living in individual dialectics where it's my truth and it's relative to my feelings.
And that's pretty much all it is at this point. It's sadly the case. I can't discuss scientific papers that have been peer reviewed. Given all the problems that peer review has, it's bearing that in mind. And even if I collect 10 papers that support a certain idea, I'm not talking about scientists agree. I'm talking about I have data that supports a cogent narrative,
right.
And a couple of scientists think like myself, and I might talk with them about this. But yeah, if I have a cogent idea that's supported by multiple pieces of different types of evidence, and I present that to like LinkedIn or people on LinkedIn, I'll get 10,000s or several dozens of thousands of views, right? That's ground to get banned, and that's not a way to understand truth or have open, honest discussion about things that are going to affect you and I, that affect my employment, that affect your kids' health, that affect public policy, that affect the economy, things like that. It's not a way to do that. It's just a way to control a narrative. And that's I understand why they want to have a narrative, but at the same time, if you have that sort of authority, you should also have that sort of responsibility, right? They're acting like petulant children.
Yeah, they're acting like it's acting like
or fearful tyrants, as Jordan Peterson would say, fearful tyrants.
Authoritarian, yeah. So I think that brings us to this week's episode. I want to thank you very much. What I want to talk about next week is
pleasure.
I want to talk about AI and algorithmic ethics, and I want to explore in next episode on how the concept of privacy versus open data and how these things are manipulated against us. So I want to talk a bit about how our own platforms that we identify with, such as Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, are weaponized actually by other parties, and and their games. So I want to talk a bit about that, and I also want to talk about the illusion of privacy in today's world. So that'll be next week's episode, if that's okay, if it doesn't change. And
we have another speaker.
We'll be interviewing somebody as well, so I'll see how that goes. Wes, do you have?
I get to do less talking then.
Wes, do you have anything that you want to wrap up with?
I mean, if can I plug my Substack, because I'm going to be putting something on there.
Of course, this is your podcast, dude.
Well, thank you. I don't treat it like that, but I probably should. Yeah, I'm going to be putting up more articles on my Substack, so I think that's you should put a link to that. Give me
what's your address?
Link and put that. Jeez, now you're asking me.
You gotta pitch it, buddy. We're going to be on audio only on Anchor.
Okay. Neuralurgist.substack.com. That's NEURALURGIST. Neuralurgist.substack.com. And my Twitter is Wezu.
And we will also have all this on DangerousDataPH soon. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. My name's Kevin. You're Wes.
Yes, it was great. Had a good time.